Okay, sorry for all the clicking. Um, Welcome to our next video. As we dive into what I think are the really substantive for our purposes chapters of this book. Not that the first four were not useful and meaningful, but when I think about the core of what it is that Jane Smiley is doing in this book, where she is really looking at the components, and I'm going to put that word in air quotes, of a novel. What I really mean is the different lenses through which one can think about and understand both novels as artifacts and novels as a process of creation, because in some way they are their own, they are the process too. Um, these are the chapters where we really get into that. These next three, really, the psychology, morality, and art of the novel, and then the circle of the novel will create some more interesting things to think about. um, Not that the other chapters aren't interesting and important, but we get some really this is where you may have noticed I feel like she spends much less time in this chapter and others really deep diving specific novels. She obviously uses a number of them as examples, but she's really saying a lot more about things. There's much greater focus on the things that we can think about from, in terms of how we think about the creation of our own texts and our own work. So, what I've done, as I've done in some of the other videos, is I've kind of plucked out what I think are some really significant passages worth thinking about and expanding on a little bit. And that's what we're going to do. So she starts off right away with what I think are some important ideas on the first and second page of this chapter. Very first sentence: the basic substance of imaginative literature is not reason but emotion, which is expressed not by the denotations of words nor the grammar of the sentences, but through the connotations and colorations of the words as employed by the author's style. There's a couple of things in here. This goes back to one of the things I always talk about, and that is the major significance and role of that language, and the choices we make with how we use it are so central to how we tell our stories. We've talked in these videos and in class already about how the only way to really do something unique is not to invent a brand new story, but is to think about what are the components of the telling of that story that you can make new. And she kind of speaks to this on the next page. This is the essential pleasure of literature: ideas going into and out of words over and over and over anytime the reader opens a book or the author takes up a pen, right? And so this use of words as a byway for communicating ideas, concerns, thoughts, observations about the world and and human beings. And so just thinking about this, what are the essentials of novels? Why do they exist? Why should we read them? Why should we write them? I think those are some of the things that really she drills down to right off the bat. And then I think also worth thinking about is, there are these many ways that novels provide some kind of pleasure. And, I feel like in contemporary terms, we've really limited what we think of as a pleasurable reading experience, in terms of like, oh, is it just like a beach read or a fluff read or something that we just have fun reading? But she gives this great list of all of these various kinds of pleasures that can be conveyed or provided through the novel. And I'm not going to read this list out loud. This is on page 86. But I think what's worth thinking about is that you as a writer, you certainly don't need to accomplish all of these in a piece of writing. But when you're thinking about what is it you are trying to do in terms of getting a reader exhilarated by or thrilled by, there are all sorts of ways to do that. And I think one of the other things she's implying here is that the reason that there are still so many novels and so many different ways of writing novels is that there are far more things than people seem to consciously recognize as pleasures attainable through reading. And I think this is a really great list that she wants us to be thinking about. So you should be kind of eventually cognizant when you're writing something of what of these kinds of pleasures are you trying to tap into as a writer. Now, okay, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because she talks about this important concept of the willing suspension of disbelief. And in the last video, I talked about this a little bit as it relates to the question of realism versus believability. And I think willing suspension of disbelief is actually quite important here, even in realism, but is important in terms of when we think about the distinction between realism and believability. This is what I'm talking about. Realism is not necessary. Believability is this idea that people have to be willing to suspend their disbelief. And what she's talking about here, and she goes over this a little bit, is disbelief is this sort of instinctive understanding that what we are reading is not true. True with with a lowercase t, as in factual. And so the question, of course, becomes, well, why would we be willing to ignore that, right? When I read a great book, I'm not thinking to myself, this isn't true, this isn't true, this isn't true. I'm engrossed in a story that feels very believable, right? And as she says on page 87, what usually puts a reader into a state of willingness is an interesting assertion. And she goes through a whole set of things. Those assertions could be observations about the way the world works, like in Pride and Prejudice or Lady Chatterley's Lover. It could be something that a character is doing in As I Lay Dying and Ulysses, a strange phenomenon, right? She talks about Kafka, and how readers have to be willing to believe, to suspend their disbelief that someone could become a bug overnight, right? And she talks about, willing suspension of disbelief is a strange state of mind. I didn't put this whole quote in here, but what she also talks about is that nonfiction doesn't require it because it is true. Neither does poetry, because they're both. She talks about poetry being based on logical argument. We're not going to get into that too much because this isn't a poetry course. But the other thing she talks about is that most intelligent and educated people have a hard time doing suspension of disbelief for a long period of time. It's brief. The difference with fiction and with novels in particular is that it has to be uniquely sustained, right? You have to be willing as a reader to experience this for a long time. And so I think it's worth thinking about, how do we get readers to do that? When we talk about world building and establishing complexity of characters and interestingness of plot, those are, I think, the things that it takes to make that suspension of disbelief. All of those tools and craft techniques that we've been mentioning and referencing at various points thus far. So let's continue with a couple of other things. I'm kind of zipping through this relatively quickly because, again, even though this is very it's a dense chapter, and so I've, again, just trying in this video to pull out the things that as I was rereading it, I kind of marked down as, ooh, yeah, that, ooh, yeah, that, ooh, yeah, that, even though I could have done that for the whole thing. But what this is a passage from her that I found interesting. Every novel is a guided meditation on a common thing, common both in the sense of mundane and in a sense of shared action and reflection as perceived from a particular point of view. And so when she says mundane, the reason I pull this one out is I want to really make sure that we're thinking about this correctly. Mundane does not mean that the events are necessarily every day, that there's nothing interesting or sort of far-fetched or quote-unquote loud happening. And when I say loud, I mean like those big life events, that can happen. But that they are essentially action and things that someone thinks about in response to those actions, and they're perceived from a particular point of view, meaning that the mundaneness of a novel, the common thing, is that stuff is happening, someone is thinking about it, and this is perceived either from that person thinking about it or someone else reflecting and considering what that person is thinking, right? That's a novel. And that's it. That's what it is. And she boils that down in this really sort of narrowed way. And she also talks about this concept of the novel as game. And I really like this because it allows, I think, by thinking of novels as games, is that can really free up some of this sense of pressure that I think some writers feel to like be very serious and be perfect from the start. And it's this notion of play. So this idea of these different levels of play, so the lowest level is simply following the sequence of the story and understanding what happens and why. Higher levels move toward greater and greater complexity and efficiency, just as professional basketball players execute more plays more quickly, more masterfully than higher than high school players do. This high level of play shapes a novel's claims to verisimilitude, in fact, making the question of verisimilitude part of the discussion of that particular novel, et cetera, et cetera. But this is all sort of balanced on the concept of the conceit, which is a form of metaphor. So like it's usually in many capacities thought of as a long metaphor whose referent is not made overt. So obviously there's no like or as, but an example I like to give is there's a famous poem from early American literature called The Wild Honeysuckle by Philip Freneau. And the poem, the overt language of the poem is all about this flower, the wild honeysuckle, but it's very clear when you read carefully that it's actually a reflection on the brevity of human life as it relates to the rest of the world, right? And so the conceit there is that the human life is never mentioned, but we understand that that's what the whole poem is metaphorically about. And so similarly, you know, when we talk about, if we think back on the notion of novels as theory and hypothesis, that's what she's talking about here, is that these simple levels of play or more complex levels of play are all working to this conceit of I'm observing something or thinking about something in the world as it relates to the outward events that I'm putting into the story, right? The shared action and reflection perceived from a particular point of view is in service metaphorically for the thing that the book wants you to think about as a reader. And so you want to be aware eventually of what those things are. Okay. And then just a couple more things. There's all of this stuff about the psychology of the writer that I think is worth mentioning. So one thing is that she talks about giving oneself over to the limbic versus the reasoning brain. And this, to me, harkens back to what we talk about with the writing process, the importance of just putting the words on the page, enjoying and letting that material out. And I'm going to jump down to this the last bit here, that one of the things that the practiced and prolific novelists have to be adept at is short-circuiting the cautious and reasonable areas of the brain that get in the way of the process, while making use of the logical faculties that organize, support, and oversee the composition of the story itself, all in service of these things that are in the middle, the figures, words, images, and ideas that are given potency and importance by feelings such as, I'm not going to read the whole list, but all of these different things, these feelings and sensations, right? And so what I think she's talking about here, large scale, is that, you know, what we have to do as writers is kind of let go of all of the training that we go through, like all of these videos, all the thinking, and just see where our brains go. What she talks about, this intuitive composition, and that great artists gives themselves over to that process. You know, they place the reasoning brain in service of the limbic brain. So kind of letting our impulses drive us, like what are our instincts about the story that we want to tell, but also at some point in the process, she says, while making use of the logical faculties, I think oftentimes it's let the playful part go first and then do the cleanup with the logical part thereafter. But she's referencing that, I think, that combination of needing to simply explore and experience to a certain degree before really worrying about the reasoning and the structuring of that story. And this is really hard because in part, we want our work to look like the great works that we read, when the reality is that we've read these finalized versions of things, not the things that the writer toiled with as they wrote. And so it's this comparison problem that we make. Like, why is this not coming out on the page just like the books that I've read that I loved? Well, odds are they didn't start that way. No matter how much somebody planned, they didn't start that way, right? And so we have to allow ourselves to play around, to let the limbic brain have control, at least to a certain degree, as we are writing. And last, near the end of this chapter, she says some interesting things about the book as a thing, shaping its psychology. You know, a novel has no independent identity as an object, in that a novel isn't, you know, a sculpture is the thing, but also has meaning. But that meaning can be separated from the actual object, because there is an object. With a book, you don't really have that. She talks about it can't really be recited in full, which she does admit it can, but it's not really going to work. You know, there are full length readings of things, but most of the time that's not going to happen. And this is an interesting statement she makes, that if a novel finds no eager readers, it does not even exist. Some of you might disagree with that, right? That I've written a book, so this book exists. I have a draft of a novel that's never been published sitting on my computer. Many writers do. Does that mean the book does not exist? I'd be curious what you think about that in the discussion board. What I really love, though, is this interesting thing, and I brought this up for a reason. A novel is more like a tomato than it is like a diamond necklace. And what she's saying here, practically speaking, is that writers want more copies of their book to be sold because they become more valuable to them as the creator the more that there are sold, right? You only get so much money, and that money is based on how many people buy your book. And so you want people buying your book like they're buying tomatoes, not buying your book like they're buying diamond necklaces, because lots more people buy lots more tomatoes than buy diamond necklaces, right? And the reason I really like this passage, and that part of the reason I'm bringing this up, is that I think we can get very precious about our work. Oh, I'm working on my novel, this project I've cared about and been driven by for years and years and years, and this means so much to me. And that's great, and that's fine. But we also need to remember that we want to treat it a little bit like a tomato. We want it to exist so that lots of people will read it. We don't want to be precious about it. We don't want to think this is we want our work to be diamond-like in quality, but we certainly don't want to get too precious about it. We don't want to treat it as too fragile or so world important that it's valued like a diamond necklace. It's much more like a tomato. And then the last thing from this chapter is this idea of authorial self-justification. And I talk about this when talking to students about publishing, is that this is going to sound bad, but no one cares if you write a book. In that, no one has asked you to write a book. Most people have not been asked to write a book. Because there's lots of books. And so you, as the writer, have to have this self-justification. Why is it important that I do this? Why does this mean something? Why will this mean something to someone? Because the world is probably going to be okay without your novel. And I'm not trying to say that to insult you as an individual listening to this or watching this, but because to make the point that we have the task of making something meaningful and understanding why it's meaningful. Right? That's what we mean by authorial self-justification. What is the reason someone should pick this thing up and eventually read it? What is it going to do for them? And we're not talking like, a motivational speech or having it be a self-help book, but there should be something that you feel justifies the existence of the work that you're doing. And so you want to think about that as you are continuing to write and be moved by the things that you're working on. Okay, that's it. I look forward to seeing, as always, what you all think of the material of this chapter.